ago, on September 15, 1940, when even their friends had proclaimed the immediate collapse of the British, the young fighting men of the Britain's Royal Air Force tore down out of the sky 185 enemy aircraft, and the German invasion forces were held up on the coast of France.
That moment was the crux of the whole war. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. One of the decisive battles of the world had been won.
But it was no time for complacency. The British then stood alone. They had before them the sternest task that had ever fallen to the lot of a single nation. First, the island fortress must be made secure. Next, the bare means of defense had to be forged for the men who had returned from Dunkirk. All this had to be done before the weapons for the great new offensive armies could be even contemplated.
The cause of humanity had lost 10 million soldiers and workers in the fall of France.
That loss had to be made good somehow from the population of the British Isles. It was a tough spot, but the people of Britain were equal to it. In 2 years, in addition to her men, Great Britain has set about mobilizing for service in field and factory 4 million women.
And throughout that dark winter, while the British people labored to offset the Nazi control of the whole war industry of Europe, every night Hitler's bombers came to break their spirit. But the army of civilians stood firm. They remind me of the British squares at Waterloo, said Churchill. But they are not squares of soldiers. They don't wear scarlet coats. They are just ordinary folk, men, women, and children, standing steadfastly together.
But Britain did not remain entirely on the defensive. Chose the very moment of her own weakness to crush the overwhelming Italian armies in Libya, and in a few months she put an end to Mussolini's much trumpeted Second Roman Empire.
Then came the attack on Eritrea, and in it South Africans and men from the Indian Empire fought alongside their comrades from Great Britain. They fought over some of the most heartbreaking ground in the world against the pick of the Italian army. Here, too, the flyers of the South African Air Force first showed their mettle. But Mussolini's African Empire, like the Duce himself, proved a thing of straw.
These victories, along with the sinkings of the Graf Spee and the Bismarck, were headlines to the long column of achievement of the British Navy. Despite grave losses at Dunkirk, Crete, and Singapore, the bitter 3-year-old Battle of the Atlantic has been waged day and night without respite.
Remember, after the loss of the French fleet, for over a year, British warships alone kept open the world's sea lanes. Between them, the men of the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy got the convoys through. The lifelines of Britain were kept open, and her long, hard winter of blood and sweat brought at last its own reward.
The production curve was on the up and up. The British people had been made angry. Now, that anger had turned to a grim determination to pay the Nazis back in their own coin. From this time on, the 9 o'clock to 6 boys dropped right out of the picture. There was no place for them in this new, war-conscious Britain.
Spring of 1941, Britain was sufficiently rearmed not only to defend herself, but to begin to hit out at the enemy. The Royal Air Force began its long, gradual counteroffensive on Germany, a carefully planned and executed reduction of the Nazi-controlled war industry.
Meanwhile, over in Africa, the long campaign in Eritrea and Abyssinia was fought to its close. The Italian stronghold of Amba Alagi was stormed and taken, and the enemy finally surrendered. Their commander, the Duke of Aosta, had proved himself a most courageous and able soldier. An imperial general took the salute at the march past. Of these, the bravest troops we had yet encountered during the whole of the fighting in Africa. In surrendering, they wrote finis to the Duce's cardboard empire.
Then came the new plan of short, vigorous commando raids on the long German-occupied coastline of Western Europe. It had a double purpose, keeping the enemy continually in suspense and starting the training of the great army of invasion, which had to be created out of an industrial people.
Germany for 70 years has coveted the Middle East, and the appearance of the Africa Corps in Libya had to be made good by the Allied reinforcement of Egypt. The European war was rapidly becoming a world conflict, and fresh demands were being made on the factories and manpower of Britain and the Empire.
They were soon put to good use in the Second Libyan campaign. First Saloum, then Tobruk, Bardir and Benghazi fell in turn to the Allied forces. Over 25,000 prisoners were captured and hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed. Thus another page was turned in the history of the war for freedom.
Hitler, realizing that the combined output of the great arsenals of America and Britain must soon outstrip his own production capacity, savagely attacked the Soviet Union to destroy her armies, to capture her industry, and by his pose as the savior of Europe from Bolshevism, to confuse the unity of purpose of the English-speaking peoples. He failed utterly.
The collaboration between the British and Russian forces, which had been proclaimed on the day of Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, was now implemented by a formal agreement between the two governments. The final blow to Hitler came in the Atlantic meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill, when they laid down the basis for a new declaration of the fundamental rights of freedom, the Atlantic Charter.
The production drive was intensified, while the Russian forces now assumed the main burden of smashing the barbarian hordes unleashed upon them. The British, from that time forward, assumed the new task allotted to them, they forced through convoy after convoy of arms and war materials to make good the losses of Soviet industry.
Meanwhile, our Russian allies gave the Hun a foretaste of what was to come. The climax of the formation of the Grand Alliance of the United Nations came in the arrival in the British Isles of the United States Expeditionary Force, advance guard of the great army preparing for the invasion of Hitler's Europe. Now linked with Britain and Russia were two more great nations, the United States and war-scarred China. Under its leader, Chiang Kai-shek, China now has 10 million soldiers in the field or in training. As Wendell Willkie said in his recent Cairo visit,
"We must hold the Mideast, and I've talked with the men who are leading the forces here, not alone here, but in other sections of the world. I have examined the production figures of America, and I have seen those of the other United Nations, and I am convinced that Nazism has reached its high tide and is now on the ebb. The recession may be long. We may have to expend many more lives and destroy much more property. But its end and the victory of the United Nations is as inevitable as the rise of the sun in the morning."
Yes, the enormous potential weight of the American production machine is at last geared into full war output. Mr. Willkie told the Middle East that in July 1942, 1 month of 31 days, United States factories turned out 5,000 aircraft, more than the combined outputs of the Axis for a similar period. Hundreds here, thousands on the way, tens of thousands more to come.
The united flags of freedom waved proudly at the meeting that thrilled the world when Britain's Premier Churchill called on the Soviets' hero Stalin. Russian Foreign Commissar Molotov met Winston on his arrival and persuaded him to talk to the Soviet people.
Whatever our suffering, whatever our toils, we will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground, until the memory only of it remains as an example and a warning for future times.
A rapid drive through the streets of Moscow to the Kremlin, where the historic meeting took place. Represented here were the foundations for the real new order, a world order led by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Britain, today the advanced striking base for the attack on Germany.
The forces of attack are accumulating fast in the island fortress. The crushing offensive of the British, American, and Allied forces is mounting.
Millions of men are being assembled and equipped with the latest weapons.
The training of shock troops and airborne units.
The construction of landing craft for men and tanks.
And above all, the air offensive of the United Nations.
Middle East, relentlessly, increasingly, the bombing of the Africa Corps supply ports and lines of communication goes on.
Whether it's over Hitler's Europe, the North African coast, or in the Pacific, the bombs of the United Nations are finding their targets.
At last, we have air superiority.
It's been a long 2 years since that 15th day of September 1940, a hard 2 years, but we've come through.
Yes, and we're going through.